Welcome to Real Talk with Chris and Kelly, where we're going to talk about real world issues. We're not going to be breaking news, and we're going to talk about stuff. So here we are, me, Chris Richardson, Mr. Scott Kelly, and I think our first topic is going to be about, you're a lawyer, and let's talk about family court. I know that you and I have a lot of personal experience in family court,
Sure.
which was I hope we're going to be able to talk about here. But I think I think most people don't understand what family court is, and for me, I've learned in my process of 5 almost 6 years going through family court, we have this process of if you are divorced, which I'm not, but if you're not married and you're going through family court, they're like two separate things, correct?
Well, yeah, there are two separate dockets. If you are married, you're under the FM docket. If you have a relationship with someone, and let's say that relationship has produced children, you're going to be under the FD docket, the domestic docket, which is not matrimonial, it's domestic. So you have an FM docket, you have an FD docket, you have an FV docket.
What is
There's
FV?
family violence.
Now, is this like in every is that like that in every single state, or is every state structured slightly different?
Most states are structured, have obviously. What is the United States? The United States is a republic. We are 50 separate countries that have banded together to form a more perfect union. Different states have different structures for their courts, different dockets, different all sorts of things. Are we basically kind of following the same thing? To a degree, yeah. Different case law, yes. But a lot of the principles that are part of New Jersey's law would also apply in other states as well. And of course, some of the law, for example, the law when it comes to dividing pensions and stuff like that, that's federal law also. So some federal law absolutely is part of the family court system.
So coming back to the family court, let's just talk about let's focus on New Jersey just for a moment because
Sure.
this is what I know, and I imagine you probably know a little bit more. And let's just talk about like the divorce part of it. If you were
Hmm.
married and you're divorced, and this is where I feel like people don't understand. Like, so you're getting a divorce, like you can either you're getting a divorce and you're pursuing the rights to your children, right? Because usually it's either alimony or child support. You're pursuing the rights to your children, or you're pursuing this alimony, or both, correct?
Hmm.
And so usually fathers that are pursuing the rights to their children, they end up being stuck in this situation where they're the breadwinners in some, in not all cases. I'll try to be general, but they're the breadwinners. So when they go to court, they end up being like, okay, well, the judge is like, well, you're the breadwinner. You didn't spend this much time with the child or the children. The mother was usually the one spending the time. So then that's how they like dictate how much time they get usually with the child in divorce.
Okay. So it used to be many, 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 many years ago that there was somewhat of a presumption that the kids were better off in the custody of the father than the mother. That switched in the 1960s and 70s, and it became presumed that the children were best served by being in the custody of the mother. And it got to such an extent that it was pretty much presumed all through the 90s that a father would have parenting time with his children every other weekend. And that's that. The father was a second class parent. That has changed to a degree. That has changed since 2000, early 2000. And at this point, I get my dad's, when they want it, when they can have it, I get my dad's a true 50-50 parenting time arrangement. I get that all the time now.
So, um, the difficulty sometimes with being married, and then this is something that kind of separates if you're married versus if you're divorced, or not even divorced, if you have a child not being married, is usually when you're married, especially in New Jersey, if you're married, you're presumed the father, right? If you have a child with your wife,
Hmm.
you're presumed, there's a presumption. So if there's that presumption, you automatically have these legal custody rights, correct?
You are presumed to have joint custody.
which is the legal custody
That's
in New
correct.
Jersey, right?
That's
So married couples, when they split, there is a presumption of custody, so you both get to make decisions.
That's right.
Is that same with the time until you go to court? Like, let's just say you divorce, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a presumption of custody or a presumption that you're the parents. Does the time at that point automatically, until there's a quarter, does it mean that the time is also automatically 50-50? Or is that like it's 50-50 until you go to court?
There's no set arrangement. There's none of that is set in stone. So you are filing for divorce. Presumably, the husband and the wife are going to have a discussion about who's going to see the kids, and if it's an acrimonial, if there's a lot of acrimony in the situation, the wife is going to probably start off right off the bat trying to limit contact with the kids. It's very unfortunate. Some people would hear what I'm saying and say, well, I haven't found that to be the case in my practice.
But do you find fathers sometimes also try to do that?
You know what? Not so much.
Okay.
Look,
Sorry.
both sexes will play games in some form or fashion or another. Men will normally play games with the money, and women will normally play games with the children. Neither one is a good situation, right? However, I would much rather see someone manipulate over cold hard cash, which doesn't have feelings and cannot embrace negativity and not grow up raising its own mutants because they had such a screwed up childhood, because they had parental alienation. I'd rather see someone screw around with the money than screw around with the head of a child.
Right. Now, so coming
So, okay, so look, you know what? I really didn't answer your question.
Okay, go ahead.
So the way that you would start it out is this. All right, we have filed for divorce. I've already been told by my wife, you're not going to get to see the kids, or whatever, right? Some words of similar import. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to file a motion for pendente liti support. That means I'm looking for something pending the final outcome of the litigation. And in that motion for pendente liti support, the first thing that I'm going to ask for is my parenting time. And I'm going to set forth my parenting time schedule, and that's going to be the first motion I make. Again, hopefully it's not an acrimonious situation. Hopefully the mother and father have had some kind of conversations about this before they even went to talk to attorneys, right? And they've at least both come to the conclusion that they should both act in the best interests of the child. Sometimes that's not the case. It's very unfortunate. Luckily, sometimes it is the case.
Now, I have done a lot of work with families just in general.
Oh, you have.
Help. I know. Helping, just trying to, help,
Sure.
with the organization that I've done. But, some things that have come back to me and some questions, are, when coming back again. So before you're even divorced, what should happen? Should the parents stay in the same house regardless of how bad it is, or should one parent leave? Because this is like a big thing. Like parents doing what is in the best interest of the child. They might say, and usually the father will be like, okay, well, I will leave so you guys have a happy house at the moment.
Always a terrible idea.
But when they go to court, then the judge is like, oh, you abandoned your family and now you lose everything.
Always a terrible idea. Okay. Always a terrible idea. So, I always advise the men not to leave the house. Stay in the house, parent your kids, maybe, finish a part of the basement or something. But it's amazing how when a guy leaves his house, right, he loses all control of the finances.
Right. I imagine also a mother the same situation can happen in reverse, but
rarely.
Okay.
Rarely. What we're talking about now is a 90-10 situation, an 80-20 situation.
Oh, wow. Okay.
All right. So I always advise the men, don't leave the house. Let the divorce play out. get yourself, partition off a place in the basement. Stay. Stay and allow the attorney to do his or her job. What's going to happen with the house? Are we going to sell the house? Is one party going to buy out the other party? How's that going to work? What happens if he moves out of the house? Now he has to support himself in his own household, and he has to pay for the roof expenses of the house? How did this guy suddenly become so moneyed that he can now support two households? Stay where you're at.
And that would be like advice in general. Just
Absolutely.
Just not necessarily legal advice, but just saying.
That's basic stuff.
Right. Just staying there.
Right.
Now, there's also now the benefit of being married is from a father's perspective is that you are considered the father. You are legally the father. You're presumed the parent. You're presumed the father, right?
Correct.
However, that's also like a double-edged sword, right? Because when it comes to infidelity and you're not the father, now you're presumed the father and you are presumed all of those legal responsibilities. And what happens like when you find out that you're not actually the father in a divorce situation like this?
That's a very good point. Here's the problem. And this is why I think the court does a lot of what it does. The court does not want, traditionally, a woman, not the man, to become the ward of the state. So they will find any reason that they can to shove it up the man's hindquarters because we as a society, we're not going to support this woman and we're not going to support the kid. So if you initially think that child's not yours, immediately you have to demand a paternity test. If you have been raising this kid for 10 years and you learn that the kid's not yours, the court is likely going to be very inclined to say, you've been supporting the kid this long, you're going to keep supporting the kid. It's not my kid. That doesn't matter.
That segues into, like the FD, or if you have a child with somebody unmarried, that segues a little bit because I feel everybody, even if you're married, a paternity test should always be suggested. It should always, no matter what, you should always have it. Period. Because that establishes paternity no matter what. And the fact that you're married shouldn't necessarily be the end all. Like, oh, you're married, so obviously we live in 2025. Infidelity is like the divorce rate is like over 50%. Like we should be making sure that if we're having kids that they belong to the parents that are intending to have those kids, right?
Look, the first thing that I'm going to say with that is this.
Okay.
I mean, if you're suspicious of your wife, what the hell kind of woman did you marry? There's a great line from a song by the Wallflowers. Cheaper lovers make expensive wives.
Ooh, oh.
Right?
Wow.
Right. So if you're not looking, if your idea of getting married is you fell in love with the stripper at Heartbreakers, you're already done.
But this situation happens all the time.
It does happen all the time. It does.
It's common enough to talk about, right?
Sure it is. Sure it is. But it happens why? Usually it happens because perhaps the guy that's looking is insecure. Maybe he feels he hasn't crafted himself into being the kind of man that can get a good woman. He finds the stripper at the go-go bar.
I feel like we can talk about the relationship part.
We can, but that's an important part. Because again, the cheaper the person that you're marrying, the more of these problems you're going to have.
Okay. So let's go over to now the scenario of
I'm probably pissed off every stripper that's watching this, and I apologize. But
let's tell everybody to take it with a grain of salt here.
Yeah,
we're trying to have just a real conversation. And,
keep in mind, I am drinking bourbon right now,
and people can always just like message and or
and they can tell me what an ass they think I am.
Of course,
I don't care.
They can chime in. So now. So we have a double-edged sword. So if you get married, you're presumed the father, and you don't have to prove paternity, but you should prove that it is, just in case of infidelity. I'm not saying that that's always a case, but
look, in my opinion, in a good relationship, in a solid relationship, you marry a girl that you trust, right? and you trust her implicitly. You have a kid. Within 6 to 8 months, right? 9 months, 10 months, you have an idea whether this kid bears any of your characteristics. If the kid doesn't, go ahead and have a paternity test done. All it is, I think now they can do it with an oral swab.
I know it's a little taboo to say that if it's very obvious if your person is cheating on you, that you're going to be able to obviously tell. But if you married somebody, they obviously have a type, and they probably are attracted to your type. So very likely you wouldn't be able to tell, right?
Oh,
If somebody's cheating on you, you're not like there's a type. They understand that that's probably what they're going for, and it'd be very difficult for you to assume that. But let's go back. Let's go over now to the if you're not married now.
I'm going to say this before we go farther. I'm going to say this. I do not believe that in a good relationship you should take your kid and, as a matter of course, paternity test. I think you should have a suspicion that you can articulate before you do something like that. If you have that level of distrust, obviously something's wrong.
Ooh, this is going to be a good topic when we talk about relationships now. Ooh, Mr. Kelly, I am ready. So let's now go over to, okay, so you have a child with somebody that you're not married. So now you have this issue where you now have to prove paternity in order to have yourself involved. And so if I could just give a quick overview of my experience and what I understand, and please correct me if I'm wrong. If you are not if you are not married but you have a child with somebody, there are no presumptions of rights for a father. Is that correct?
No. You still have joint custody. You are still the father and you still have joint custody.
Well, explain this, because I was in this situation. I was not put on a birth certificate.
That was the problem. Had you been on the birth certificate from the very beginning, right? She kept you off of that.
Hold up.
Okay.
But then at that point, the mother has the choice, because she's the one giving birth, to add you to the birth certificate.
You know what? You kind of have to demand. When you're
But if you're not involved,
you've got a girl. You got her pregnant.
Right.
Okay. You're dating her. She's going to the hospital to deliver the baby. You go to the hospital. You talk to the people. That is my daughter. I am Chris Richardson. Her name is Richardson. Or whatever.
But my point is, if they don't invite you, like if you are not, I was never invited to the hospital.
If you're not
invited
right,
to the situation, you can't confront it, right?
Now you're underwater and you have to kind of
right. So now, but that is the baseline of most legal situations,
right,
for fathers that are unmarried,
right,
unless the mother puts you on the birth certificate. But then again, you're also now in that circumstance in this situation where she could just put anybody on the birth certificate. She could just say, "Hey, we hooked up, and now you're the father."
And then you have to sue for a paternity test.
Well, in general, like, wouldn't you say that no matter what, you should just have a paternity test? In an unmarried situation, you should always have a paternity test, right? Because that's how it was for New Jersey. Is they paternity and then they decide parenting time. That's how the situation went in my situation. I know it's complicated, right?
It is complicated.
Even for a lawyer.
It's not complicated necessarily legally. It's complicated from the standpoint of what is the relationship that you're in and how are you going to what will harm the relationship and what won't. If you can take the child and secretly have the child paternity tested just by doing an oral swab and that satisfies your curiosity, okay, then do it. Fine.
But we're talking about non-married trying to establish custody, trying to establish rights, right? And I was just giving, like, so if you're not married, you have to go through this process of filing in court,
yes,
filing for paternity, filing for parenting time,
correct,
filing for custody even.
Yes.
Because you don't just presume custody.
That's correct.
Because I think the court wants you to know that you're the father. They want to know. Everyone wants to know. If you're not married, they want to know who the father is before they establish custody.
Look, you start off in a much better standing. If you want to have a connection with this child, you have a much greater standing if you get your name on the birth certificate immediately.
Right.
Much better. So for those guys that are listening, that that are saying, well, my girlfriend's pregnant. Okay, you want to be involved in this child's life? When that woman goes to deliver that baby, be at the hospital, get your name on the birth certificate that night.
But I feel like
that date, that whatever.
this is where a conflict happens. If you're married, you're presumed the father, correct?
Right.
You should be loyal to your person.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're not married, there is no loyalty insinuated. Whoever they put on their birth
Well,
certificate
you're
is
in a
considered
domestic,
the father.
You're in a domestic relationship, right?
Right.
Okay. So you're in a domestic relationship. In theory, you're going to the hospital with your girlfriend, right?
Okay.
You're going to have your name put on the birth certificate.
What
You're going to acknowledge that that child is yours.
Let's play a little devil's advocate for a second. First
Sure.
off, if let's just say again, you're not married, and you go to the hospital and you're that supportive role, and she puts somebody else's name on that birth certificate.
Well, let's put it this way. I guess you're off the hook.
It's not necessarily about being off the hook. I'm talking more for the fathers that want to be fathers, and either they find out that that child is not theirs, or
For that man that you just described who does not want to be off the hook, that father then files an action to establish paternity.
right. But again, we're talking about active fathers. We're not talking about fathers that don't give a shit.
No, we're talking about the guy that you just said who wants to be the father, but you put someone's name on the birth certificate. For that guy, he has to immediately go out and he needs to file a paternity suit.
Right.
Right.
Right. So, okay. So to back up here. So, a big difference between custody
And I
and
handled
rights.
one of those too.
Oh boy. I imagine lots of them. Hold on, let's not talk about that right now.
Okay.
We don't have to bring that up at the moment. But
Because that's a very interesting point too. We'll get back to that.
Okay,
We'll
okay.
circle around to it.
So again, if you're married, paternity is already assumed,
Right.
right? So the father is like, you're locked in, and you have to prove if at some point in time that's not your child, and you realize that, like, you have to prove that it's not. For one, you have to do a paternity test. But then again, if you and this is where, like, the double-edged sword again is, like, if you assume that that's your child being married and you take care of it for any amount of time, then the court automatically presumes you're the father, and now you have those child rights.
That is true.
So there are scenarios, and coming back again to, if you're not married, this is why it's so important again to establish paternity for all parents. Mothers obviously know paternity unless they're being.
No, they can actually be very, very active and not know whose child it is.
So in general, everybody should establish paternity, right? Everybody. Everybody should. Because then you know what you're fighting for. Because if you don't know what you're fighting for, like, whether you're married and especially if you're married, that would be the worst case scenario. Is if you're married and you think that everything is wonderful, hunky dory, and then 5 years down the road you find out it's not your child, and even though you might love them, that's totally fine. I'm not against that, but now you're like, wow, that was like a huge infidelity, and if you want to move on with your life, because as a father, you should have that option. Even though most guys I don't think would. You should have that option. If it's like, wow, you did this. This is not even my child. You should be able to walk away.
You only have that option for so long.
Right. But if you're already paying child support, you're already established, and now you're on the hook for 18 years, right?
Up to 23 years.
There you go. But again, I was trying to talk a little bit separate, but it's hard. It's hard to talk about both subjects and individualize them because, they are so similar. And I feel like we're moving very much away from the idea of a traditional relationship in marriage, and it's just everything is becoming so much blended. No,
Are we moving away from it, or are we starting to move back to it? I see signs that tell me that we're starting to move back towards it, but I don't know.
I know that in from what I see, Christian nationalism is becoming very popular, which is trying to bring back the family.
That's correct.
And I think that there's a lot to that. I think there's, a lot. Family values is really, really important.
It is.
And I think traditionally, sorry, not traditionally. I think in the modern era, I think we have to fix that. And I think we fix that by figuring out, how do we fix relationships?